Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Ziauddin Faculty of Law, Politics, and Governance podcast. This is your host, Ali Hassam al Haq, and with me, as always, is the brilliant Professor Alex Lawson. Thank you for being with us again today, Alex.
Thank you, Ali, for having me again.
Of course, it's always a pleasure. And today, since we're following suit on our series of discussions on international law, we're going to touch upon a topic which is rather important, in fact, of critical importance. It has some security elements, some political elements, as well as some philosophical elements of discussion. And the topic largely is terrorism, but specifically focusing on starting off with, sort of defining what the word actually means, and similarly following suit, what would be considered as a terrorist group. So, Professor Lawson, I'll sort of run the first question by you, which is that so what exactly is a terrorist group, and is there any largely accepted international legal definition to the word?
Yeah, it's proven very, very difficult to define terrorism without simply resorting to saying that it's something we don't like, because that's not much use. The definition that's sometimes given is a group that wants to cause terror. But the problem with that definition is that it doesn't really help us that much. As Lawrence Friedman has kind of pointed out, a lot of terrorism isn't actually that terrifying. It's not actually that scary. Whereas, for example, serving in the military might be. Perhaps the simplest definition is simply a non-state actor that uses violence to pursue some kind of political objective. That's not a perfect definition, because sometimes we approve of those non-state actors when they're doing that. If they're fighting in, for example, a liberation struggle against an oppressor, then we might classify them as a national liberation struggle. But usually it's when there's a non-state actor using violence to pursue a political objective that is outside of an otherwise democratic process. I'll give you an example, which is that people often say that Nelson Mandela's terrorism was justified because he had no choice. It wasn't like he could go and get people to vote for him. Whereas when you have a terrorist group like the Irish Republican Army in Ireland, or the Basque separatists or the Catalan separatists in Spain, they do exist within a democracy. So they can just get people to come around to their way of thinking by talking. So I think that's the definition of a non-state group that uses violence to pursue a political objective. It's not perfect. It's the best we're going to get.
I see. But that's very interesting. You mentioned that certain struggles for liberation are considered to be justified, or rather encouraged even against an oppressor. But wouldn't that sort of make every movement fall into this category? Because the way you see it, terrorist groups are essentially non-state groups which are pushing a specific agenda or a specific point of view or a specific change in status quo that they would like. And the existing mechanism of that state, wherever they are located, may not be conducive to this group achieving their ends, whatever those ends might be. And of course, we'll assume for this hypothetical example that those ends are benevolent, right? So based on that, how do we distinguish or make a distinction between terrorism and terrorist groups and people fighting for self-determination, simply?
I mean, the answer to that is that it is very difficult. I think what I would take issue with is your assumption that it's benevolent, and that's how you get the difference. Groups fighting for self-determination may have a legitimate right to use violence to achieve self-determination. But if you go back, there were lots of terrorist groups that had very obscure and strange objectives. I mean, certainly until the period from the 1950s to the early 1990s, there were terrorist groups that were trying to establish communism in different states. And we're talking about terrorist groups that are trying to establish communism in Western democracies, where their percentage of polling as political parties is like 1%. So they try to use violence to get their in another way. And there are other groups that pursue very odd forms of self-determination that really were not what we would describe as self-determination. So that's one way out of it. But yes, I mean, if you fundamentally don't agree that a group has a right to self-determination, you are going to label them as terrorists. And if you agree that they do, then you're going to go down the route of saying it's a liberation struggle.
So who gets to attribute that label to any group that this is a terrorist outfit?
Yeah, I mean, usually it's the state that's involved. But of course, the problem with that is that it's very, very subjective, and it's within their interests to call everybody a terrorist. It's interesting that one of the side effects of 9/11 was that lots of states could use the logic of 9/11, apply it to themselves, even though in reality it wasn't really applicable. In fact, they were dealing with groups that had a right to self-determination, but they could just call them terrorists and say, well, terrorists are currently, the world's enemy. There is another way of doing it that's a little bit better, which is that the United States and the European Union and other entities will classify groups as terrorist organizations, and that will put them onto a blacklist, and that will mean that they are then subject to sanction. And the benefit of that is that it's usually a group that has nothing to do with that state or the European Union. So it's a group that operates outside of the United States and outside of the European Union, but it's classified as a terrorist organization by them. And that has huge ramifications because it means that they can't get aid or access to banking services and things like that. There is no international arbiter that's impartial that says this is a terrorist organization. But the best you're going to get is probably the European Union.
So are there any recent or contemporary examples of terrorist groups, and is there any sort of overlap between these groups and criminal outfits?
Yeah, this is one of the problems, is that, of course, terrorist organizations usually use crime as a means of funding themselves. So when you have large-scale criminality going on, it can often be linked to a terrorist organization. You could argue, for example, that happens, obviously, where you have things like terrorist groups who, commit bank robberies, and they do it in order to get money. But there are also other examples of where you could argue that criminality goes so far that it becomes terror in itself, because the criminals aren't just raising money anymore, which is what criminals normally do. They're actually pursuing terrorist aims in order to achieve that. And Mexico is the best example.
Literally thinking about the South American cartels and then the examples of, killing entire families, hanging them by their necks from a bridge, and then, stopping the authorities from even bringing down the bodies in a dignified manner, simply to send a message to the people that if you cross us...
It's not just about money, because it is about money, but in order to control large amounts of money and to stop the state from interfering with their activities, they have to have a political edge.
An element of fear in society.
Yeah, so that's an example of where, one of the terms we use is narco-terrorism, because it's terrorism based around drugs, but there's other forms of terrorism, terrorists, other groups that engage in people trafficking, and other forms of trafficking.
I see. But that age-old phrase, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Of course, we're coming back to the same sort of discussion. But has there been any example in the recent past, or perhaps longer than that, in which a certain organization has been mislabeled a terrorist organization, which later was retrospectively discovered to not be such?
Well, again, usually it's where the label is applied solely by the state in question, so the state that's the victim of the violence, and they will describe it as a terrorist organization. And with hindsight, you would say it isn't. There are some pretty good examples. I mean, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, were described as terrorists, but I don't think there's anybody now who would look back on their activities and say it was wrong. They would say that it was justified. And other groups that existed in other times and places, were called terrorist groups, and have subsequently been seen to be actually, there's good violence and there's bad violence, I think, and I think it's totally unrealistic to say that all uses of violence outside of the political process are automatically bad. If you look at the foundation of Israel itself, and this is one of the ironies, the foundation of Israel itself is based around terrorist groups who fought campaigns to basically persuade the British to leave, and were actually successful. It was one of the few examples in history where a terrorist campaign has been successful. Did a series of terrorist attacks. The most famous is the bombing of the King David Hotel, but there are others. Just persuaded the British that it wasn't worthwhile staying there, and so they left, and that opened the way for what became the formation of the State of Israel. You can look these up. The Stern Gang is a famous example of a Jewish terrorist group that at the time was operating in what became Israel, but at the time was the British mandate in Palestine. And at the time they were described as terrorists, but what they did was help to create the State of Israel.
Right. So are there any other examples in the recent past in which terrorist groups, such as this example, in which terrorist groups have actually been successful in achieving their objectives?
Yeah, it's very, very unusual. The statistics that you can get, if you look at the studies, are around 5% of terrorist organizations succeed. Generally, they don't. So it is quite difficult to think of any examples. They might succeed in a certain way, in that they get some of what they wanted, and then they abandon the rest. But the idea that a terrorist organization will defeat a military is unusual. The reason is simple. It's because normally when you're running a military campaign, the more successful you are, the more what we call permissive the environment becomes, the safer the environment becomes. So the more successful your military is, the safer it is for them to operate. They can operate more freely. Whereas terrorism, usually works the other way around. If you run a successful terrorist campaign, all you do is mobilize the military to come down on you like an absolute ton of bricks. So your successes are actually triggers for failure. The stupidest thing Al-Qaeda ever did was 9/11, because it brought the United States down on them and effectively destroyed them. And in a certain way, you could argue the same thing about Hamas, that the stupidest thing they did was the 7th of October attacks, because it led to their largely physical destruction. In both cases, it's not as simplistic as that, because I think in both cases they wanted to achieve something in terms of publicity and sympathy. And certainly I think Hamas have been successful because Israel's response has been so dreadful that all the sympathy is with Hamas and the Palestinians.
Obviously, nothing justifies occupation and genocide the way they're sort of,
That's what I agree. But that's how I'm trying to explain how it's odd that it's unusual that these things work. The IRA never got close to achieving their objectives in the United Kingdom, nowhere near achieving their objectives. And it's true, again, most terrorist organizations don't. The reality is that you and I are just not that scared about terrorism. We don't go to bed at night worried about being blown up by somebody, even though there are terrorist campaigns in parts of Pakistan, and we just saw recently in Balochistan. But generally speaking, it just doesn't bother us much.
Yes, it's statistically insignificant, of course, in the larger picture of things. But coming to addressing what you said about if terrorist organizations are actually doing a good job, then they're doing nothing besides attracting attention to themselves and the wrath of the sovereign state that they're located in, the jurisdiction of. Which raises a question in a person's mind that why don't these groups proceed to, sort of formalizing their political presence, perhaps forming a peaceful political party and actually going through the entire democratic process and the system, if we may call it that, to actually, engage in discourse about their wishes and wills and make it happen or effectuate it into policy through the actual legitimate process rather than resorting to unwanton use of violence.
Well, this is a much more common way that terrorist groups end. Outright victory is very unusual, but transforming into something else is much more common, and it's essentially has happened many, many times. The PLO um, went from being a terrorist group to being the representatives of the Palestinian people. Now, there are other groups that carried on using violence and obviously still exist in that area, but that's what happened to the PLO. They became normalized, as we say. It happened with the IRA in Northern Ireland and the whole of the United Kingdom. They became part of the political process. They just became political actors. And it happened, as everyone knows, famously in Colombia, where the extreme right-wing paramilitaries and left-wing paramilitaries in Colombia just gave up and agreed to become political parties and not violent anymore. And the surprising thing is that in these examples, these groups really did give up violence. They genuinely did do it.
So stood by
Yeah,
their promise.
you would expect them just to lie, but for example, in Northern Ireland, years after the process began, there was a decommissioning of weapons program put in place, and they actually did decommission their weapons. So that does happen, and it happens. I think it happens for a reason. You might as well, why don't they just do that straight away? They try terrorism and it doesn't work. And there's another reason which is controversial, but I think is worth mentioning. Social scientists argue that there's an old phrase which is young men make war and old men make peace, right? And social scientists suggest that as groups get older, they start to become more interested in peace. Because you're an old man, you're going to die, you're not going to achieve your objectives by violence. There's a strong incentive to try and achieve them by peace. Whereas young men tend to be hot-headed and think that they can win, and they can't. And this is actually one of the problems with Israel's policy of targeted killings, because they just kill everybody before they can become reasonable. And they just get replaced with another hot-headed 20-year-old who wants to bomb everybody. And the cycle just goes on like that.
I see. So it's interesting how you're mentioning that one of the way that terrorist groups end or reach their termination is by evolving into another shape, taking a political form, and some examples of them relinquishing all forms of violence as well to achieve their ends. Is there any other ways that terrorist groups can actually achieve an end? Because the famous quote goes, I think it was an American general who mentioned in passing, and somebody published it in a book, saying that battling these terrorist factions in this region in Afghanistan were kind of like the heads of the Hydra. You cut one off and you have 3 more splinter cells that emerge, and then you have sleeper cells that you just don't detect until they become active. And so they're so fragmented in area, in what they're doing, in what they're planning. They have no consolidated communication networks, no very clear hierarchy. Although yes, you do understand the management a bit, but there's no clear defined hierarchy. A lot of intelligence work goes into that. So I mean, how can you battle a movement that sort of is shaped like this? And also Noam Chomsky's quote is coming to mind, is that terrorists are not born, they're created.
Yeah.
And so by aggressively fighting or violently tackling terrorist groups, in a way the people who are fighting them are also actively creating the next generation of terrorists, so to speak. Because the moment a person grows up thinking that my brother or father or mother or loved one has been killed, perhaps they were innocent, perhaps they were a part of the collateral damage that happened, and weren't actually directly involved in the terrorist activities. But they obviously harbor that same resentment, those same emotions, and then they grow up with that hate in their heart that, whoever did this to my family, I might like to, sort of retaliate. So how do these entities target terrorist groups, and how should states respond to terrorist groups generally?
Well, I think one of the answers as to what happens to terrorist groups, which is the initial part of your question, is that sometimes they're militarily defeated. Now, again, that's quite unusual. It's probably almost unusual as they're militarily successful. But there are examples where they just wiped out. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elat, known as the Tamil Tigers, don't exist anymore. They existed until about 15 years ago.
In Bangladesh, if
Yeah,
I'm not
Sri
mistaken.
Lanka.
Sri Lanka,
Sri
sorry,
Lanka.
yes.
And they were simply destroyed militarily. And it was a horrible operation with a tremendous loss of civilian life, as you can imagine, because it was literally just pushing this group further and further towards the sea and just shelling them. But, victory was achieved. There is no more civil war in Sri Lanka. There's no more terrorism in Sri Lanka. There used to be a lot of bombings. You have to remember back to the 90s and 80s, and there would be lots of terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka. So they can be militarily defeated. That's not new. That's not that common for the reasons you mentioned. The Hydra problem is also described as whack-a-mole. With that game you play where a mole comes up and you bash it with a hammer, and then the problem is that it just keeps coming up, and all you're doing is that forever. And that's something that the U.S. military in Central Command in Africa have described recently as being the problem. It is whack-a-mole. I think that to a degree that's what we've got, and we just have to do that. We have to respond. Your wider point about can we use violence against terrorist groups? The answer is we can.
But should we?
Well,
or rather, the question was how should states respond to these terror
well, I
groups?
mean, we can't necessarily just give them what they want, because what they want might be anti-democratic. And also, there's another problem as well, which is that I certainly think this is true for Al-Qaeda, that I still don't know what Al-Qaeda want. They never articulated a program that made much sense of what they wanted. They never really even mentioned the Palestinians very much. That was never something that bin Laden was that bothered about. Or sometimes groups articulate something that's just so unrealistic, you're just not going to countenance it. So we can't give them what they want necessarily. We can engage with them in certain ways. We can, for example, try to stop people from becoming radicalized. And that can be done by, for example, emphasizing things like aid to groups. There's some very interesting recent information, polling information by a group, I can't remember its name, I think it's called Arab Barometer, something like that. And it's a group where they do polling in Arab states. And what's interesting is they found that support for the United States has obviously collapsed since Gaza, but at the same time, people they still believe that the United States provides significant aid to them and helps them in that way. And we can ramp those programs up and, provide people with a future that's better than the one they have. And I certainly think in Gaza, that's something we need to do. We need to provide aid that's not just going to rebuild buildings, but it's going to rebuild jobs.
A bit hypocritical, though, isn't it? Supplying weapons to Israel and military aid to Israel and supplying aid to the victims in Gaza.
Well, they're not so much supplying it to the victims of Gaza, they're supplying it to other states in the region at the moment. But in the long term, the United States is never going to stop supplying military aid to Israel. It's got to stop the fighting and then make the aid that's being supplied to Gaza meaningful. So things we can do, but, and this is the big but, we still have to be able to use military means. We can use military means to contain terrorist groups, to keep them at a safe level. And my final point, and this is really cynical, is that, yes, as Chomsky, I disagree with him on most things, but he's right. Obviously, terrorists are made. But often you hear things like, this thing will cause more people to join a terrorist group, So, for example, a drone strike in Yemen will make more people terrorists. But if you live in London, you don't care if more people in Yemen are angry and become terrorists, as long as they stay in Yemen. Your only real concern is whether they come and actually do anything to you, the chances of which are very, very slim. So using military action a long way away to contain a group a long way away, that then has very little chance of ever actually impacting on your people, makes a certain sense. one of the arguments that was raised, and I've heard this from an American general, but I don't agree with it. His argument was, well, he had two arguments. He said, one, we're killing them faster than they can make them. In other words, we're killing terrorist leaders, insurgent leaders faster than they can be created. I don't agree with that. But secondly, he said something interesting, which is maybe Iraq's not the disaster that it looks like because that's where all the terrorists are going. So instead of going to America or Britain or Australia or wherever, they're all going to Iraq. Now, again, that's super cynical, but it does make a certain sense. You create this sort of honey pot area where people go and act, use violence because they think it's going to have a large impact and they don't think they're going to suffer any consequences.
But I mean, on the other hand, if we look at Afghanistan and we see the US's military incursion into Afghanistan and their sort of presence there for around 2 decades, over 2 decades rather, based on that, they obviously used a lot of force to try to curb insurgency in the area. But when the US troops were pulling out of Afghanistan and the Taliban were once again taking over, there was little to no resistance by the people, the common citizens, to this. And in fact, it raised some interesting topics or interesting arguments or discussions on the matter of legitimacy, that whether the propped government backed by the Americans was actually legitimate or not, or the current government after their pulling out was actually legitimate. So this seems like a sort of failure of asserting violence to curb these threats, or what are perceived threats for that matter. I think that would be more accurate. But people appear to be happy in Afghanistan. I mean, of course, there's a lot of issues still there. Human rights abuses are still there, but the people did not resist the Taliban takeover once the Americans pulled out. So that seems to be a failure of using violence to curb these matters.
Well, I mean, the Taliban were never popular. And when you argue about legitimacy, legitimacy is just being content with the way things are, really. So, a monarch can be legitimate if people are happy to have the monarch. Then the government that was, propped up by the United States enjoyed probably more legitimacy than the Taliban did. But I think there's a sense that Afghans are they're used to this. And in other words, they're used to governments changing because it's happened so many times in recent years. And they understand that that's just part of life. We would regard it as a catastrophe. For them, it's just, well, it's another catastrophe to go with all the other catastrophes. It's something that, without getting into national character, but national historical memory can play a role. British people are very proud of the fact that nobody's invaded Britain for like 800 years, and Americans can say the same thing. And Pakistan has been Pakistan without any foreign interference, for 75 years. But Afghans are kind of just used to the fact that somebody comes in, changes everything, announces they're in charge, and then they're replaced eventually by somebody else.
Yeah, the Soviets tried.
Well, because there was an Afghan government, then there was an Afghan. Basically a monarchy, then there was an Afghan communist government, then there was the Soviets in charge, then there was the brief period of the Civil War, then there was the Taliban, then there was basically the Karzai government, and now it's back to the Taliban again, And in 80 years, they've had, 6 different regimes, and not just different governments the way we understand it, completely different radical regimes. In fact, the only really constant is the Taliban. They're the only group that went away and came back. None of the others did. They just disappeared or went back to the state that they originated from.
But isn't it interesting to see that the Taliban was regarded as a terrorist organization and now they're the legitimate government of a sovereign country?
I'm not sure that the Taliban were not recognized as the government of Afghanistan, except for by 2 states, which are Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And I don't think it was necessarily that they were regarded as terrorists. I think they were regarded as very sympathetic to terrorists, and very close to terrorists.
Important
Um,
distinction.
yeah, yeah, and sometimes it can be a very thin distinction. And this, of course, is what George Bush eradicated. The Bush Doctrine says there is no distinction. If you support and tolerate terrorism, you are the same. But that's a very blunt thing to say, and it's not necessarily a sensible doctrine. Um, but yeah, they're regarded as sympathetic to terrorism. And yes, they are now the government of Afghanistan. I think states just don't recognize governments if they can avoid it. And there's nobody who's like saying the Taliban are, we officially recognize them and endorse them. It's just that you have to deal with them. You know, you have to deal with the government of Afghanistan, and it happens to be the Taliban. And so it's de facto rather than de jure. But that's kind of normal anyway, because if you look around Africa, you've had so many coups recently that you still have to deal with that state, even though you don't think the government's legitimate, you think it's replaced a democracy or something else, you still have to actually deal with them.
I see. So, quite an interesting sort of analysis on that. Is there room, if any at all, for discussion, for dialogue, for reaching a peaceful consensus on these issues, rather than resorting to a terrorist attack and counterattack and a circle of violence?
There's always room. There's always room for talking.
Has it been successful in the
Yeah,
past?
it worked in Northern Ireland. It worked in South Africa. What happened in South Africa was simply that the white leader of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, who actually just passed away recently, it just realized that this was unsustainable, that you couldn't keep repressing the black population, that they would either eventually be able to in a position to carry out enough terrorism to destroy or destabilize the state, or what would happen is that the white minority would have to be so repressive that it would make it impossible for them to have any place in the world. And so he decided to end it, and did. And within like 3 years, Nelson Mandela went from being imprisoned to being the president. It worked in Northern Ireland. If you go back, you get people in the 1980s saying they will never, ever, ever even get in the same room as this guy. And then they end up being in government together, literally being in the same government together. And they seem to be getting along as friends, because they have to. Yasser Arafat met, I can't remember who the prime minister was, I think it was Shimon Peres, in the Oslo Accords. So there's always room for talking. And when everybody says we'll never talk with that group because they're terrorists, they always end up, well, not always, but they often end up talking with them, and it does work. Right?
What factors made it work, as opposed to regions in the Middle East or other problematic areas?
You can be totally pessimistic and say, for example, there'll never be a peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But that people said the same thing about the Arab states. Arab states, you said, no recognition, no negotiations, no acceptance, the three no's. And then you had Egypt, and then Jordan, and then Bahrain, and Sudan, and the UAE, and forgotten the other one, Morocco, all recognizing Israel. And that's a huge thing, because it went from being we will never do this to okay, we now do it. So strange things can happen. I think that it's often a result of unique historical circumstances, and that's the reason why. Because you might get a peace deal, and you'll go, "Why is it happening now? Why didn't it happen before?" The beginnings of the peace deal for Palestine, which has not been successful, but it for a while it looked like it would be, which is the Oslo Accords. That was really because of the Gulf War of 1991, because following the Gulf War, the Palestinians had taken a position on the Gulf War that was a stupid position to take. But there was also this feeling that because Israel was a potential factor in the Gulf War, it was attacked and was restrained from not responding, that we could sit down now and actually try and come up with a solution. So I think historical circumstances have something to do with that, and you might not even realize they do. There are people out there, and I think they're very optimistic, who actually think that this is going to lead to the peace deal. That the bloodshed we're leading will actually lead to a comprehensive peace deal, because it's putting the Israelis in such a terrible light that the only way out is to come up with some comprehensive, peace. Netanyahu has no idea what he wants to happen in Palestine after the violence is ended. He's made some vague statements about it, but really has no idea. But then he's just a wartime leader. He's not going to be the leader much longer. So factors like that, actual tragedies and events can have a role in it. In Northern Ireland, the peace deal was looking shaky, and then what happened was there was a large bomb went off from dissident Irish Republicans who didn't want a peace deal. And that bomb united everybody from all the different sides. Is the Omaha bomb in pursuing the peace deal, right? So those 27 people died, but that actually made the peace deal work.
So that seems like a genuine example of how bilateral talks, multilateral talks actually worked out. With the Israel example, it's a bit disgusting that it's not the human life element or the suffering element that will, make them change course, but rather the reputational damage they're suffering that will make them change course. I mean, that's a bit ridiculous to the even palate, but what it seems when you sort of shed light on this area is that it seems like a psychological sort of a process that leaders need to they need to be aware that enough people have suffered, enough people have died, that it's not worth carrying on the conflict. I mean, which is something a rational mind can foresee if you sit down and give it a minute of thought. But then again, I think it was Aristotle who quoted that we won't see peace until all kings are philosophers and philosophers are kings.
Yeah.
Something of that sort. And I tend to agree with that because, at least in my personal opinion and my considered professional opinion rather, peace is much more conducive to progress. Peace is much more conducive to abundance, to living a better quality of life. And of course, conflict is a very core part of the human experience. But you see, we've been given a gift that other species haven't, the gift of cognition, the gift of advanced cognitive processes, that we can actually sit down, think about repercussions of our actions and decisions, and to also collectively unify on plans, policies, and sort of systems that are designed or are structured in such a way that will create benefit for a majority of people. And I think it's these elements of either being too isolated or solipsistic in your mind, or marginalized to the extent that you feel that you don't have a reasonable voice in the management of state affairs, that leads to this feeling amplifying. But honestly, if we can get past certain core human deficiencies, and I call them deficiencies, greed is a deficiency, I feel, because it shows a sort of failure of a person to move above that, move past that, defeat that inner animalistic nature that a person can have, and so that failure results in them sort of acting out that I need this, I want this, I want this, power hungriness, hunger for resources, for money, for influence, for ideological sort of propagation of their ideals as well. So, but at the end of the day, I certainly personally hope that humankind can see reason, although statistically we're living in the most peaceful era we've ever had in history. We have the least amount of wars or deaths happening now due to violent acts of war than we've ever had in the past. So, I mean, it's obviously a positive in a certain direction, but the general narrative doesn't seem to be changing. There is a lot of escalation. We seem unable to try to be we seem unable to negotiate with ourselves as well as people we consider our adversaries to actually reach a peaceful consensus which both sides are happy with. A lot of times I feel that it comes down to an individual's ego. Because like you said, if it hits a point where there's enough bloodshed and suffering, then peace is the only rational next step. what stops that from happening, let's say, 1,000 deaths ago or 2,000 deaths ago? Why didn't we reach that point then? Before 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 people suffered or died afterwards. So that shows that there's a very particular power struggle happening in this entire process, and certain egos and big, sort of thoughts of leaders or the shot callers are also involved that don't allow them to take certain steps that might be better for everyone involved, but for their own personal reasons, they are unable to take that step. So my prayer is that everyone can rise above that and, sort of nip this problem in the bud and, try to, instead of trying to change the world, first change ourselves internally and maybe move towards a more peaceful
I
world.
mean, I think that the reason why there is usually so much bloodshed is because militaries tend to go through periods where they become overconfident in their abilities, and the IDF are overconfident in their abilities. They think they can secure peace through a military solution, and then what happens is you get a period where the military realize that in fact that was not possible, and then they reduce their activities. In the West, it seems to be on a sort of 20-year cycle that there's 20 years where everybody goes, we can't get involved because it won't work. And then everybody forgets that, and then they decide they can get involved and see if it will work. In other words, an intervention of some kind to resolve some kind of public order problem in the world. And what you have at the moment is an IDF that believes it can achieve military success, and perhaps to an extent, Hamas and other groups think they can achieve success. Other actors in the region think they can, and of course the answer is they can't. And going back to why Israel will change because of the PR. Israel won't change because its people will suffer, because its people don't suffer. They live fantastically good lives in their very, very wealthy state. So you're not going to sort of bring the violence to them. Hamas tried that, and okay, 1,700 people died or something, but that's not a massive amount. And it's you're not going to defeat Israelis by making them poor and weak. You're going to maybe eventually persuade them to change their mind by humiliating them. That's essentially what they've done to themselves.
So it appears to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, a considered response to the Hamas attack that took maybe 2 weeks and involved a series of strikes on military targets and inevitably killed some Palestinians would have been reasonable. And we wouldn't be in this disaster we're in now. But it's been like a year. Well, it has been a year.
Yeah, more than a year.
And there's no sign of it stopping.
Yeah, very unfortunate. But this has been quite an interesting discussion, Professor Lawson. I thank you for your insight, your valuable analysis, and the information that our audience as well as myself have learned from you today. Of course, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. There are certain things that I might not agree with in terms of your analysis, and vice versa. But such is the beauty of being able to have a open discourse about these topics, and which, like I said, we hope that other people and other factions and other sort of groups that do tend to engage in violence, both state and not state, can understand and engage in discourse to reach peaceful solutions to these problems rather than resorting to violence, and specifically violence that leads to collateral damage, which is the main issue. I hope our audience enjoyed today's episode. Thank you, Professor Lawson.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much. And stay tuned to this space. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you and goodbye.